It's clear that life in 18th century France was pretty awful even for the average Catholic, but for Protestants it was completely unbearable, especially in the deep south, where they were barred from public office and from key professions, or even ordinary trades like bookseller, goldsmith, or grocer. Marriage by Protestant ministers was considered invalid, and the children of such unions illegitimate. Protestant families were subject to draconian punishments and fines simply for practicing their faith, and were often killed in the streets by fanatics. There was a lot of pressure on people to convert, and many did, some purely out of convenience, and reports abound about many Catholic priests issuing certificates of conversion, for a nominal fee, of course. So it was that the eldest son of one Monsieur Jean Calas, a draper from Toulouse, had tried to escape the dead-end life of a Protestant by seeking to obtain one such conversion certificate. But the local parish priest was not up for a bribe, and demanded instead a written testimony of faith rather than cash. To pay a bribe was one thing, but to betray his true beliefs in cold ink was just more than he could bear to do. Now, Monsieur Calas' younger son did indeed convert, and the father faced the reality of it even though he didn't like it. But the older one wasn't going to budge, and instead strung himself up one night in despair. It was bad enough to lose a child in such a horrible way, but when locals began accusing the father of murder, things began to get really dark. Murmurs had begun that the boy was looking to convert, and that the father surely did him in out of rage. Local religious fanatics were baying for blood, and a kangaroo court convicted the entire family, including their maid, of complicity in the murder, and they were sentenced to death. An appeal brought the mother a stay of execution, and the maid got life in servitude, but the father ended up on the rack, slowly tortured to death while screaming his innocence to his dying breath. The youngest son had meanwhile fled and came to the famous Voltaire to plead for aid, and when he told him the whole story, Voltaire was outraged and vowed to assist. He swung into action, calling on acquaintances from far and wide, which now numbered thousands of people with connections in high places. Eventually, he managed to initiate a Crown inquiry into the conduct of the trial. The local magistrates and religious prosecutors were stunned as the High Court subpoenaed all their files. It turns out that the king himself had now heard of the case and agreed that something must be done. Voltaire paid for the entire inquest, lawyers' fees, and court costs, which were substantial. In 1763, a year after Calas' unjust execution, the King's Council of over 80 ministers sat to consider the case, an unprecedented gathering for the sake of a commoner, and they unanimously concluded that the trial was deeply flawed and that the verdict should be annulled. The whole of Paris, gripped by the drama, erupted into celebration at the declaration of Jean Calas' innocence. His hapless widow was given a compensation by the Crown, and other indicted individuals were also released and compensated. Voltaire was now a hero without comparison and a beloved champion of the little guy. As you can imagine, a flurry of similarly heart-wrenching miscarriages of justice bombarded him, and he again acquitted a number of them in similar dramatic and public fashion. Too many to recount them all here, but his experience in these matters strengthened his resolve to continue battering at the door of religious intolerance and judicial fairness, most eloquently expressed in his treatise on toleration, finished shortly after the inquiry. In this essay, Voltaire argued for religious tolerance, advocating for the separation of church and state. He criticized religious persecution, fanaticism, and the abuses of religious authority. The treatise influenced the development of the concept of religious freedom, which became a cornerstone of modern liberal thought. But, yet again, the powers that be were horrified and burned it with indignation.